July 10th, 1943. Dawn breaks over Sicily, and the horizon fills with ships over 500 vessels, carrying 160,000 Allied troops toward Italian beaches. It is the largest amphibious invasion in history to that point, larger than anything previously attempted, a demonstration of Allied power, so overwhelming it cannot be denied. For Benito Mussolini, watching from Rome, as reports arrive of American and British forces storming ashore on Italian soil, this is the beginning of the end, not the military end that came long ago in North African deserts, where Italian armies collapsed and Axis dreams died. This is the political end, the moment when the facade of fascist strength cracks beyond repair, and everyone in Italy's power structure realizes simultaneously that the deuce has led them to disaster. 25 days. That's how long Mussolini has left in power. 25 days from Allied invasion to political coup, from military catastrophe to arrest and imprisonment. It happens fast, not because anyone planned it carefully, but because everyone sees simultaneously that Mussolini is finished, and the rats begin abandoning the sinking ship before it takes them down too. This is the story of those 25 days, of how Allied military success translated into Italian political collapse, how a dictator who seemed unassailable became a prisoner in his own country, and how the king he had served for 21 years betrayed him with cold calculation. It's a story about power, how it's accumulated, how it's maintained, and how quickly it disappears when the fundamental basis for that power evaporates. Mussolini built his power on strength, on victory, on the promise that fascism would restore Italy to greatness. When Allied troops landed in Sicily, that promise was revealed as hollow and everything collapsed. The Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, was conceived as the next logical step after victory in North Africa. By May 1943, German and Italian forces in North Africa had surrendered, ending the campaign that had started in 1940. Over 250,000 Axis prisoners were taken, including Afrika Korps veterans and entire Italian divisions. The Mediterranean was now controlled by Allied naval forces. The question was what came next. American commanders wanted to concentrate on the cross-channel invasion of France to strike directly at Germany. British commanders, particularly Churchill, argued for attacking what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy, and the Balkans, to knock Italy out of the war, tie down German forces, and open new fronts before attempting the risky channel crossing. The strategic debate consumed weeks, but eventually Churchill's view prevailed. Sicily would be invaded, then mainland Italy. The justification was partly military secure. The Mediterranean forced Italy's surrender open another front, but also partly psychological. British commanders believed fascist Italy was weak, that Italian military morale was broken, that one good push would cause total collapse. They were more right than they knew. Sicily was defended by approximately 300,000 Italian and German troops, though combat effectiveness varied wildly. Italian coastal divisions were undermanned, poorly equipped, and had low morale. Many soldiers were middle-aged reservists who wanted nothing more than to go home to their families. German divisions, particularly the Hermann Göring Division and 15th Panzergrenadier Division, were much more capable, but far fewer in numbers. The island's defences were designed to repel invasion at the beaches, but Italian commanders knew the defences were inadequate. Concrete bunkers were incomplete. Artillery was outdated. Anti-tank weapons were scarce. Logistics were catastrophic. Supply shortages meant units lacked ammunition, fuel, even food. Officers reported these problems repeatedly to Rome, but Mussolini and his generals either couldn't or wouldn't address them. The fascist state was broken at fundamental levels, unable to resource and sustain military operations, but the Arot had been hidden by propaganda and denial. Sicily would expose everything. The invasion began in darkness with airborne assaults that went badly. Paratroopers scattered across the countryside, many landing miles from objectives, some drowning in the Mediterranean when their aircraft released them too far from shore. It was chaos, but it didn't matter. When the amphibious forces hit the beaches at dawn, Italian defenders fired briefly and then surrendered in droves. Entire battalions gave up without real resistance. The overwhelming Allied firepower, naval bombardment that pulverized defensive positions, air superiority that prevented Italian counterattacks made continued resistance seem pointless. Italian soldiers who had endured years of war, who had seen their armies defeated in Greece and North Africa, who knew their equipment was obsolete, and their cause lost, made rational calculations. They surrendered to save their lives. By the end of the first day, Allied forces had established beachheads all along the southern coast of Sicily. The invasion was succeeding beyond the most optimistic projections. German forces responded with professional competence, launching counterattacks, establishing defensive lines, buying time to organize a fighting withdrawal. But Italian forces were disintegrating. Units retreated in disorder. Command and control broke down. Mussolini's commanders in Sicily reported disaster. They couldn't stop the invasion, couldn't even slow it significantly. Allied armoured columns were pushing inland, capturing towns, reaching the interior. The civilian population in many areas welcomed the invaders as liberators, tired of fascism, tired of war, willing to accept defeat if it meant peace. Within days, it was clear Sicily would fall. The only question was how long German forces could delay the inevitable while evacuating to mainland Italy. For Mussolini, the military disaster was catastrophic, but the political implications were worse. Italian soil was being conquered. Italian forces were surrendering en masse. The Duce's promises of military glory and restored empire were revealed as fantasies, and everyone in Italy's political elite was watching, calculating, preparing for what came next. In Rome, Mussolini met with his senior generals and fascist party leaders. The meetings were tense, filled with recriminations and desperate planning. Some generals argued for total mobilization, for fighting to the death, for loyalty to the Axis alliance. Others, more numerous and more realistic, argued privately that Italy needed to exit the war, needed to seek separate peace with the Allies, needed to abandon Germany before Germany dragged Italy into complete destruction. Mussolini was trapped. He had tied Italy's fate to Hitler's Germany, had built fascism around the Axis partnership, had staked everything on Axis victory. He couldn't abandon Germany without destroying the ideological foundation of his regime. But he also couldn't continue the war because Italy was militarily defeated, economically exhausted, and politically unstable. He tried to negotiate with Hitler for German reinforcements, for equipment, for support. Hitler made promises, but delivered little. German forces in Italy were there to defend German interests, not to rescue Mussolini. The two dictators met at Feltre on July 19th, in what would be their last meeting as allies. Hitler lectured Mussolini about fighting harder, about Italian weakness, about the need for total commitment. Mussolini listened, passively broken and diminished. The meeting revealed what everyone in Italy's leadership already knew. Germany would not save Italy, and Mussolini could not save himself. The coup against Mussolini was not sudden improvisation, but careful conspiracy among Italy's elite, who had tolerated fascism when it succeeded and now abandoned it in defeat. The key figure was King Victor Emmanuel III, the diminutive monarch who had allowed Mussolini to seize power in 1922 and had served as nominal head of state throughout the fascist period. Victor Emmanuel was not a strong character. He was weak, indecisive, prone to accommodation, but he had one crucial advantage: constitutional legitimacy. Despite 21 years of fascist dictatorship, Italy remained technically a constitutional monarchy, and the king retained the legal authority to dismiss the head of government. Victor Emmanuel had never exercised this authority because Mussolini was popular and successful. Now that Mussolini was unpopular and defeated, the king suddenly rediscovered his constitutional powers. Around him gathered a conspiracy of fascist party officials who wanted to save themselves, military commanders who wanted to end the war, and aristocrats who wanted to preserve the monarchy. They planned carefully, aware that Mussolini still controlled security forces, still commanded loyalists, and might resist arrest violently. The trigger came on July 24th, at a meeting of the Fascist Grand Council. The the party's highest governing body that had not met in years because Mussolini governed by decree without consultation. Dino Grandi, a longtime fascist official who had served Mussolini loyally for 2 decades, introduced a resolution calling for the king to resume his constitutional powers, effectively asking Victor Emmanuel to dismiss Mussolini. The motion was treasonous, but Grandi had built support among Grand Council members who recognized that Italy was losing the war and that continuing under Mussolini meant destruction. The debate lasted 10 hours through the night, with Mussolini defending his record and his detractors arguing that Italy needed new leadership. At 2:40 a.m. on July 25th, the vote was held. 19 members voted for Grandi's motion, 7 voted against. The fascist Grand Council had voted to remove Mussolini from power. It was stunning betrayal officials who owed everything to Mussolini, who had profited from fascism for decades, voting to destroy him to save themselves. Mussolini left the meeting shocked and uncertain. He still believed the vote was advisory, that the king would support him, that his position was secure. He was catastrophically wrong. Later that day, July 25th, Mussolini was summoned to a meeting with King Victor Emmanuel at Villa Savoia in Rome. Mussolini arrived expecting to discuss the political crisis, expecting the king to back him, expecting to navigate another crisis as he had navigated dozens before. Instead, the king informed him curtly that he was dismissed from his position as head of government, that Marshal Pietro Badoglio would replace him, and that Mussolini was under arrest for his own protection. It was over in minutes. Mussolini, stunned, was escorted from the villa by carabinieri officers and driven away in an ambulance to prevent recognition. He was taken to a carabinieri barracks, then moved repeatedly to prevent German rescue attempts, first to the island of Ponza, then to La Maddalena, finally to the Gran Sasso mountain resort in the Apennines. The Deuce, who had ruled Italy for 21 years, who had created fascism, who had dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire, was a prisoner. The collapse was complete. 25 days from invasion to imprisonment. 25 days from dictator to prisoner. It happened because everyone who had supported Mussolini when he was strong abandoned him when he was weak, because power in dictatorships is always provisional, always dependent on success, always vulnerable when that success disappears. The Italian population learned of Mussolini's arrest via radio announcement. Badoglio's new government proclaimed that Italy would continue fighting alongside Germany, but nobody believed it. Italians celebrated in the streets. Fascist symbols were torn down. Party offices were attacked. Years of repressed anger erupted. But the celebration was premature. Italy was about to pay the price for betraying Germany. Hitler learned of Mussolini's arrest almost immediately and recognized it as betrayal. He knew Badoglio was preparing to negotiate with the Allies, knew Italy would switch sides, knew Germany had to act fast. Hitler had already prepared contingency plans: Operation Alaric for occupying northern Italy, Operation Axis for seizing Rome and rescuing Mussolini. Within hours of learning about the coup, Hitler activated both plans. German forces in Italy, reinforced by divisions rushed from France and the Balkans, moved with stunning speed. 8 German divisions swept through northern Italy, seizing control of roads, railways, communications, and government buildings. Italian military units were given ultimatums: join Germany, disarm peacefully, or be destroyed. Some units joined the Germans. Most disarmed without resistance. A few fought and were crushed. By early September, German forces controlled all of northern Italy. They had occupied the country in less than 2 weeks, one of the fastest and most complete military occupations of the entire war. The occupation revealed German efficiency and Italian chaos. German commanders had detailed plans, clear objectives, and ruthless determination. Italian commanders had contradictory orders from Badoglio's government that vacillated between resistance and accommodation. Italian soldiers didn't know whether to fight Germans, surrender to Germans, or simply desert and go home. The result was organizational collapse. Entire divisions dissolved. Officers abandoned their commands. Soldiers discarded uniforms and weapons and fled. The Italian military, which had numbered over 1 million men in Italy alone, essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force. Hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers were captured by Germans and sent to labor camps in Germany, where they spent the rest of the war as prisoners. The Italian Royal Navy, one of the largest in the Mediterranean, sailed to Malta and surrendered to the Allies to prevent German capture. But several ships were sunk by German air attacks during the transit. The Italian Air Force's remaining aircraft either fled to Allied-controlled territory or were seized by Germans. Everything Mussolini had built over 2 decades of dictatorship vanished in weeks. Rome itself became a prize Germans coveted. German paratroopers attempted to seize the city, but Italian forces defending Rome actually fought, producing several days of combat in the city's outskirts. Badoglio's government, fearing capture and German reprisals, fled Rome on September 8th, moving south toward Allied lines. The king, the new government's senior military officers all abandoned Rome and sought Allied protection. It was undignified and cowardly, but it saved their lives. German forces entered Rome on September 10th and occupied the city. Italy now had no functioning government. Badoglio and the king established a government in exile under Allied protection in southern Italy. German forces controlled the north and center of the country, and somewhere in the mountains, Mussolini remained imprisoned, waiting to see what happened next. The armistice between Italy and the Allies was announced on September 8, 1943, formally ending Italy's participation in the war on the Axis side. It was supposed to be coordinated with Allied military operations to protect Italian forces from German retaliation, but the coordination failed. The announcement came before Allied forces were in position to help. Italian military units heard via radio that Italy had switched sides and were left to decide individually what to do. Most surrendered to Germans or disbanded. Some joined the Italian resistance and began fighting Germans as partisans. A few units declared loyalty to Mussolini and joined German forces. Italy fractured into competing factions, civil war merged with occupation, and the country descended into chaos that would last until the end of the war in 1945. German occupation was brutal. Hitler viewed Italian betrayal as racial confirmation of Italian weakness and treachery. German forces treated Italy as conquered territory, implementing harsh occupation policies. Jews in Italian-occupied zones, who had been relatively protected under Italian administration, were now rounded up and deported to death camps. Italian civilians were subject to collective punishment for partisan activities. Entire villages were burned, their populations massacred in reprisal for resistance operations. The German occupation of Italy was not designed to win hearts and minds. It was designed to extract resources and maintain control through terror. Italian partisans resisted, conducting guerrilla warfare, sabotaging German logistics, killing German soldiers. The resistance was brave and morally justified, but militarily, it was costly. German reprisals killed thousands of Italian civilians. The Italian population, caught between German occupiers and partisan resistance, suffered terribly. Mussolini's story didn't end with his arrest. On September 12th, German special forces, commanded by Otto Skorzeny, conducted a daring glider assault on Gran Sasso and rescued Mussolini from his mountain prison. It was a propaganda coup, demonstrating German loyalty and Italian incompetence. Hitler installed Mussolini as head of the Italian Social Republic, a puppet state controlling German-occupied northern Italy. The Italian Social Republic was fascism's final pathetic form, a government with no sovereignty, ruling territory it didn't control, serving German interests enforced by German soldiers. Mussolini governed from the town of Salo on Lake Garda, far from Rome, isolated and impotent. He spent the final 18 months of his life as a German puppet, watching his life's work collapse around him. When Allied forces finally liberated northern Italy in April 1945, Mussolini attempted to flee to Switzerland. He was captured by Italian partisans on April 27, 1945, and executed by firing squad the next day. His body was taken to Milan, hung upside down in a public square, and abused by crowds who had once cheered for him. It was an ignominious end for a man who had dreamed of empire. The political drama of Mussolini's downfall reveals essential truths about dictatorships. Mussolini's power was based entirely on success, on military victories, on economic growth, on the promise that fascism would make Italy great. When those successes disappeared, the power disappeared with them. Mussolini had no institutional support, independent of personal loyalty, and personal loyalty evaporates when the patron can't deliver rewards. The fascist Grand Council betrayed Mussolini because he couldn't protect them anymore. The king betrayed Mussolini because the monarchy's survival required it. Military commanders betrayed Mussolini because continuing the war meant destruction. Everyone who had supported fascism when it succeeded abandoned it when it failed. There was no loyalty, no ideology, no commitment beyond self-interest. Fascism was a protection racket that worked only as long as the deuce could deliver, and when he couldn't, the racket collapsed. The speed of collapse was stunning. 25 days from invasion to arrest. 6 weeks from arrest to German occupation. 3 months from Sicily invasion to Italy split between German occupation and Allied liberation. Everything Mussolini built vanished faster than it was created. 21 years to build the fascist state, 3 months to destroy it. The disproportion is striking and instructive. Building states is hard, requires institutions, requires legitimacy, requires buy-in from populations and elites. Mussolini built a state on personal power and force, which was easy but unstable. When the force failed, the state collapsed because there was nothing underneath supporting it. Compare this to democracies that survive military defeats because institutions remain even when leaders fall. Italy in 1943 had no such institutions. It had only Mussolini, and when Mussolini fell, everything fell with him. The betrayal by Victor Emmanuel III deserves particular examination because it was cold-blooded and calculated. The king had enabled fascism, had appointed Mussolini, had signed laws that destroyed Italian democracy, had supported the wars in Ethiopia, Spain, Albania, and against the Allies. Victor Emmanuel was complicit in everything Mussolini did. When Mussolini was strong, the king supported him. When Mussolini was weak, the king betrayed him. There was no principle involved, no moral courage, just survival instinct. Victor Emmanuel preserved the monarchy by sacrificing the dictator he had empowered. It worked. The Italian monarchy survived until 1946, when a referendum abolished it, giving Victor Emmanuel 2 more years before his dynasty ended. Historians debate whether the king's betrayal of Mussolini was brave or cowardly, principled or opportunistic. The answer is clearly opportunistic. The king acted to save himself, and the timing waiting until Mussolini was obviously finished demonstrated cowardice, not courage. A courageous king would have acted in 1940 when Mussolini dragged Italy into war, or in 1941 when Italian defeats began, or in 1942 when disaster became obvious. Acting in July 1943 after Allied invasion made the outcome clear, was merely jumping from a sinking ship at the last possible moment. German occupation of Italy was lightning fast because German military planning anticipated Italian betrayal. Hitler never trusted Mussolini completely, and certainly never trusted Italy as a reliable ally. German contingency plans existed for every scenario, including Italian defection. When the defection came, German forces executed pre-prepared plans with typical German efficiency. 8 divisions swept through Italy in 2 weeks, because they knew exactly where to go, what to seize, and how to disarm Italian forces. The speed created the impression of overwhelming power, but the reality was careful planning and Italian disorganization. German forces didn't conquer Italy, they occupied a vacuum created by Italian political and military collapse. The lesson is that military occupations succeed when the occupied state has collapsed. Germany couldn't have occupied Italy if Italian military forces had resisted cohesively. But Italian forces didn't resist because they had no reason to resist, no leadership, telling them to resist, no belief that resistance would accomplish anything. So they surrendered or disbanded, and Germany walked into the resulting vacuum. The human cost of Italy's collapse was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers became German prisoners and spent years in labor camps. Thousands of civilians died in the chaos of occupation and civil war. The Italian Jews who had survived until 1943 were now vulnerable to German persecution, and many were deported to death camps. Partisans and civilians caught in reprisals were massacred. Cities were damaged by Allied bombing and German demolitions. Infrastructure was destroyed. The economy collapsed. Northern Italy became a battlefield where Germans' allies and Italian factions fought until April 1945. Southern Italy was liberated earlier, but remained impoverished and damaged. Italy would spend decades recovering from the war and from fascism's collapse. The Allied invasion of Sicily achieved its immediate military objective, capturing the island, but its broader strategic impact was mixed. Italy switched sides and stopped fighting, which was a success. But German occupation of Italy meant the peninsula became a battleground where Allied forces fought brutal campaigns up the Italian boot through 1943-1944 and into 1940. The Italian campaign consumed Allied resources, caused tens of thousands of Allied casualties, and didn't prevent Germany from defending effectively. Critics argued the Italian campaign was a strategic mistake, that resources should have been concentrated on the invasion of France. Supporters argued that Italy tied down German forces, provided air bases for bombing campaigns, and demonstrated Allied commitment to the Mediterranean. The debate continues among historians, but what's undeniable is that Italy paid the heaviest price. The country was invaded, occupied and fought over for 2 years, suffering destruction that took decades to repair. Mussolini's downfall was inevitable, once military defeat made his position untenable. But the speed and manner of collapse were contingent on specific decisions by specific people. If Victor Emmanuel had supported Mussolini, the fascist regime might have lasted longer, though ultimate defeat was still certain. If the fascist Grand Council had remained loyal, Mussolini might have kept power through 1943, though again, eventual collapse was inevitable. If Italian military forces had resisted German occupation, the occupation might have been bloodier and slower, though German victory was still probable, given Allied inability to intervene quickly. All the counterfactuals lead to the same conclusion. Italy was defeated, Mussolini was finished, and the question was only timing and details. The invasion of Sicily triggered the collapse by making defeat undeniable, and from that moment, events moved with inexorable logic toward Mussolini's arrest, Italy's armistice, and German occupation. The 25 days from July through 10 to August 3, 1943, from Allied invasion to Mussolini's imprisonment, represent one of the fastest and most complete political collapses in modern history. A dictator who had ruled for 21 years, who had seemed unassailable, who had created an entire ideology around his personal power, was arrested and imprisoned in less than a month. The collapse happened not through popular revolution, but through elite betrayal. The same people who had supported fascism abandoned it when continuation meant personal destruction. There was no loyalty, no ideological commitment, no willingness to go down with the ship. Everyone saved themselves by sacrificing Mussolini, and Mussolini, who had built his power on force and personality, rather than institutions and legitimacy, had no defenses when the elites turned against him. The lesson is that dictatorships are inherently unstable because they depend on the dictator's continued success. When success ends, the dictatorship ends usually quickly and violently. Mussolini learned this lesson in the back of an ambulance driving away from Villa Savoia on July 25, 1943. When he realized that the king he had served, the party he had created, and the people he had ruled had all betrayed him simultaneously because he could no longer deliver what they needed: victory, power, and survival. He had promised them glory and delivered defeat. That was his crime in their eyes, and they punished him with removal, imprisonment, and eventually death. The 25 days that destroyed Mussolini began with Allied troops landing in Sicily and ended with a dictator in chains. and everything between was political drama of the highest order, betrayal, conspiracy, collapse, and the cold calculation of elites saving themselves by sacrificing the leader who could no longer protect them.